Hello, folks. Today I'll be talking about A Christmas Carol by Charles Dickens. I wanted to do something Christmassy in time for the holidays and thought this would be a great story to explore. I know it well, as I've seen many adaptations over the years, and while I have my favorites, I can't think of one that really stands out as too terrible. But since I'd never actually read the book, I picked up a copy in preparation for this video. What a great little story. It's a quick read. If you haven't actually read it, I highly recommend it. It's pretty clear why it's a classic. There's a joyful liveliness and simplicity to the story, yet it also has depth. And there are many ways to approach the story for analysis. For one thing, Dickens plays around with the idea of the story itself being a Christmas carol by titling each of its 5 chapters a stave, by which he's referring to a musical stave or staff. And so that's a fun angle for exploring the story. And I will explore why I think the story is called A Christmas Carol at the end. Then, of course, it's a moral tale and a Christian story for sure. And there are many overt Christian themes and metaphors that could be delved into. But then, underneath all that, it's also a deep dive into the psyche. And since I love stories that reveal truths about ourselves, I'm going to be focusing on what this tale tells us about the psyche and why it's so brilliant. So this story basically addresses the problem of how to get the ego self to wake up and listen to a truth that is being repressed. What Scrooge needs to discover about himself isn't something new to him. It's something he already knows deep down, and the story accomplishes the illustration of this waking up process through the metaphor of ghosts in a couple of different ways. First there is Marley, the dead business partner, and then come the 3 spirits. Since the story literally starts with Marley, let's start there too. The first sentence tells us, Marley was dead, to begin with. And Dickens spends a little time having fun with this concept as he expounds on the idea that old Marley was as dead as a doornail, and, well, isn't a doornail a strange simile to use in such instances? Wouldn't a coffin nail be more appropriate? So from the beginning he sets the tone that this is going to be a ghost story, but it's meant to be fun. Marley is a big part of the first chapter, or stave. He haunts the entire chapter as Dickens mentions him throughout, so he ends up staying on your mind. And he makes sure we understand that the only real distinction between Marley and Scrooge, before we actually meet Marley in his ghost form, is that one is dead and one is still living. So when we're introduced to the iconic Scrooge, he is immediately established as a cold, unlikable man. No wind was bitterer than he. And Dickens sets Scrooge's journey in motion on a foggy night with, once upon a time of all the good days in the year, on Christmas Eve, old Scrooge sat busy at his counting house. Now, once upon a time is a staple of fairy tales, so this sets a dreamlike stage for the story. We find that Marley's name is still on the sign alongside his own, hanging above the warehouse door, and we are told that people often confuse the two and sometimes called Scrooge Marley and Marley Scrooge, but Scrooge answered to both names. It was all the same to him. Dickens tells us that Scrooge is a scraping, clutching, covetous old sinner, hard and sharp as flint, from which no steel had ever struck out generous fire. And then he gives us 4 successive examples of Scrooge rejecting those who appeal to him for humanity. So first we see him reject his poor clerk, Bob Cratchit, the coal he needs to stay warm. Wherefore the clerk tried to warm himself at the candle, in which effort, not being a man of strong imagination, he failed. This is one of my favorite lines. It really captures Scrooge's meanness, and then shows how pitiable yet endearing Cratchit is. Then, when Scrooge's nephew Fred comes calling to ask him to dine with him on Christmas, he rejects him with his iconic bah humbug. Scrooge insists Fred has no reason to be happy since he's not wealthy, but ends up becoming even more irritable when Fred proffers with sincerity the idea that Christmas is not about wealth and status, but a kind, forgiving, charitable, pleasant time, when men and women seem by one consent to open their shut-up hearts freely, and to think of people below them as if they really were fellow passengers to the grave, and not another race of creatures bound on other journeys. And this is a beautiful allusion to the journey that Scrooge will be taking this evening. And of course, this speech only makes Scrooge more upset, setting him up to be quite ready to reject two businessmen who come calling for a donation for the poor. One of the gentlemen asks Scrooge if he has the pleasure of addressing Mr. Scrooge or Mr. Marley, to which Scrooge replies that Mr. Marley died 7 years ago this very night. Again, we are reminded of Marley's death and that we are meant to see that there is only this one distinction between the two men. When the men appeal to him for empathy for the poor, Scrooge coldly replies, "Are there no prisons? Are there no workhouses?" One of the men replies, "Well, many can't go there, and many would rather die." Scrooge then coldly returns, "If they would rather die, they had better do it, and decrease the surplus population." And finally, perhaps most importantly, he rejects engaging in a simple, practically effortless kindness when he scares off a poor young Christmas caroler. The owner of one scant young nose, gnawed and mauled by the hungry cold as bones are gnawed by dogs, stooped down at Scrooge's keyhole to regale him with a Christmas carol. But at the first sound of "God bless you, merry gentlemen," Scrooge seized the ruler with such energy of action that the singer fled in terror, leaving the keyhole to the fog in even more congenial frost. And with that final act of coldness, the stage is securely set. We, the audience, can see the situation clearly now. Dickens has been very explicit here. He shows us that Scrooge's problem is pretty straightforward. He's a miserable and miserly old man who not only rejects the needs of his fellow man, but does not even have it in his heart to show kindness to a wretched child on Christmas Eve. He's an archetypal miserly king, tyrannical in his miserliness almost beyond belief. Scrooge shows no kindness to anyone, even when it would be easy and cost him nothing. That's a level of stinginess that we all know is wrong. Dickens shows us this explicitly because it's something we should already know. All of us, including Scrooge. So the problem isn't what should we do, but how can we get ourselves to listen to that inner voice that already knows what we should do? Now, as Dickens gives us clarity to the problem with Scrooge's character, he makes the night around him grow foggier by the minute. The fog and darkness thickened so, the ancient tower of the church, whose gruff old bell was always peeping slyly down at Scrooge, became invisible. Scrooge has entered a metaphorical state of confusion. In stories, particularly in fairy tales, but this extends to any story that maps strongly on the psyche, the fog is like a dark forest where there's a blurring of boundaries in which it is easy to get lost. In this part of the story, the fog represents the unconscious realm of the instincts and emotions. In Freudian terms, this can be thought of as the id. So, in a sense, he has become emotionally distraught and confused. He's lost his connection to his moral self, which can also be thought of as the superego, and this is causing him confusion and emotional discomfort. We see this with the disappearance of the church bell that watches over him and how he is left surrounded by the confusing fogginess of his emotions. Without getting too lost ourselves in this metaphor, suffice it to say that he's developing an inner conflict where his emotions are all stirred up because he's not listening to what he knows to be true deep down. The nephew, who came calling in the spirit of the holiday, made good arguments about the meaning of Christmas, and Scrooge is fighting it, and he's in denial. Oftentimes we get very emotional and on the verge of admitting a hard truth. And this is where Marley comes in to start the ball rolling on helping him shift the fog. Dickens has us follow Scrooge home to his wretched, stark, and cold mansion. It's actually Marley's house. It was left to Scrooge when he died, and in this dismal place we get to meet Marley's ghost. When Marley finally manifests, he comes up from the basement of the home dragging his chains. As we discussed earlier, Scrooge and Marley are essentially one and the same, except that Marley is dead, and now we know that he is weighed down by the chains of his heartless devotion to money and life. Marley is a shadow aspect of Scrooge, and that's why they are one and the same. Yet Marley carries the truth, the reality that Scrooge is ignoring. Scrooge knows that he is acting badly. He knows the consequences. He just won't admit it. Marley represents this repressed truth in ghostly form. And it's so fun how Dickens plays with this concept by having Scrooge reason that he's just manifested this vision based off of his poor digestion. He tells the ghost of Marley that there's more of gravy than of grave about him.
More of gravy than of grave? What a terrible pun. Where do you get those jokes? Leave comedy to the bears, Ebenezer.
In stories, the feelings and emotions can be represented in many different ways, like with the confusion of the fog earlier. And also, they're often represented through food and digestion. So if a main character has a friend or counterpart who's always eating, that character is likely an unconscious representation of some part of his id. Think of Gimli from Lord of the Rings or Ron from the Harry Potter series. Here, Marley has arisen from the basement or bowels of the house in order to alert Scrooge to what is happening to him because he is the aspect of Scrooge that knows. He's right there with the truth. He's an emotional aspect that won't let him ignore the truth that he is repressing. Though Scrooge is joking that he thinks the ghost is just a bit of his poor digestion, what Marley represents is actually something Scrooge is having trouble assimilating or digesting in his psyche. Dickens explains that Scrooge was not much in the habit of cracking jokes, but that the truth is that he tried to be smart as a means of distracting his own attention and keeping down his terror, for the specter's voice disturbed the very marrow in his bones. And this is what can happen when we encounter a truth we are not willing to admit to ourselves. We might distract ourselves by deflection and denial. So how do you fix this problem when you're in a denial of a truth you know deep down? Well, ideally, you develop the ability to be mindful and listen, which is a skill in and of itself. But if you can't get yourself to listen willingly, Dickens shows us another, more grueling way. And so Marley, the emotional aspect that knows the truth, makes Scrooge listen by frightening him. Scrooge makes another joke to try to diminish Marley. He tells him that if he swallowed his toothpick, it would just come back and haunt him as a legion of goblins. This sets Marley off. The spirit raised a frightful cry and shook its chain with such a dismal and appalling noise that Scrooge held on tight to his chair to save himself from falling in a swoon. Now, this is what our emotions do when they know what's up and we're ignoring them. Think of when you're anxious and you don't know why. Well, if you quiet down and listen, you might discover what's going on. Our anxiety usually has something to tell us, just as Marley has a message for Scrooge. When Marley has Scrooge's attention, he tells him the hard truth. He says, "I wear the chain I forged in life. I made it link by link and yard by yard. I girded it on of my own free will." And he points out that Scrooge is doing this to himself and that his chain was just as long as Marley's when he died 7 years earlier, so it's now 7 years worth of greed and heartlessness longer. Marley goes on remorsefully, "In life my spirit never roved beyond the narrow limits of our money-changing hole." And then he says that he is captive bound and double ironed and that no space of regret can make amends for one life's opportunity misused. So if we step out of the metaphor for a minute and imagine Scrooge as this believable character who's an old miserly man sitting in his dead friend's house on the anniversary of his death, we can imagine him becoming aware that his friend died unhappy and alone. And that is why Dickens shows him as a ghost. The idea of Marley, the idea of how he lived and how he died, is haunting him. And suddenly, Scrooge can see now that Marley took the wrong path and that he doesn't want to end up like Marley. And sometimes the best way to get ourselves to pay attention and learn is to first recognize the problem in someone else and judge it for what it truly is out there and in them. And then, if you're brave enough, you can then admit that maybe this is also going on within you and pass the same judgment upon yourself. Which is why I say this video is about you. It's about all of us, me too. Scrooge is meant to be a larger-than-life version of this problem so we can see it clearly. We all can see it play out in exaggerated form, but once we see it, we're supposed to reflect back upon ourselves and make sure we're not in any small way acting the same. Fortunately, this story shows us that even though it is scary to admit when we've been wrong, or even in this case horribly wrong, there is still a path to redemption. If you can just get the ego to jump the hurdle of pride and willfulness and admit the truth, you can turn things around and end up in a glorious place. Now, one might think that it's enough for the problem to just be laid out explicitly like this, but unfortunately, time has showed us that we humans are slow on the uptake when it comes to developing wisdom from hard truths. So Dickens hammers the point home by bringing in the three spirits. All right, so let's do a very brief recap of Scrooge's journey with the three spirits. First, he gets taken back in time by the ghost of Christmas past, where he remembers how he was once a lonely child cut off from his family. Then he gets to see himself getting to connect later on in life and enjoy the beauty of the holiday season. He gets to remember how his respected and loved former boss showed him the right way to celebrate and connect and give. Then he fast forwards a bit and somehow he has lost connection to that truth, and he sees how he made his first big regrettable choice that set his story in motion. He chose money over the love of his life, Belle, prompting her to accuse him of displacing her with a golden idol. And finally, he gets a glimpse outside his own conscious realm at how Belle did without him and how she thrived. And with this, he becomes distraught. He grabs the spirit's cap and extinguishes his light and represses him. Then comes our second spirit, the ghost of Christmas present, who we find is large and gregarious and full of life. This spirit takes him through the present Christmas and shows him how Bob Cratchit is faring with his beautiful family on his meager income, and he learns that Bob has a little boy, Tiny Tim, who is very ill and will likely die. And then he sees how his nephew and family and friends celebrate and laugh at how mean and sad Scrooge is. And then Scrooge discovers that the spirit has aged and that he has two small wretched children with him, want and ignorance. And when Scrooge asks if there's anything that can be done for them, the ghost taunts him with his own cold words. Are there no prisons? Are there no workhouses? Then with a resolved heart, he looks to the ghost of Christmas yet to come. This spirit takes him to a Christmas where some pitiful wretch has just died friendless and alone. His belongings are being scalped by opportunist vultures. He's shown that Tiny Tim has died, and then finally he's shown his own gravestone, where it is revealed that he is the poor friendless wretch. This story relies beautifully on the classic story dynamic of threes. And we get this most strongly in the form of these three spirits. Three is a kind of magical number in storytelling. It shows up repeatedly in fairy tales as it focuses our attention and alerts us that something is important. It's a common technique to repeat things 3 times when using rhetoric, when trying to create a persuasive argument. When you hear things 3 times, it's more likely to snag your attention, and then the point tends to sink in better. Think of Eliza Doolittle's father from My Fair Lady.
I'm willing to tell you. I'm wanting to tell you. I'm waiting to tell you.
See how by the third phrase he has our complete attention. This is the same idea with the 3 ghosts. By the time we get to the third and final spirit, we have a pretty good idea already what we're supposed to have learned from this adventure, but when it's presented in its final form, it's in its most severe guise. It's as if Dickens is saying, "Are you paying attention now? This is serious." And then he brings in the big guns, the silent ghost of Christmas yet to come, pointing to the cold, hard truth. It's really cool how, as we go through the 3 stages with the 3 spirits, there's this ascendant quality in time, while Scrooge is taken further and further out of himself. It starts with Scrooge getting to see his own memories. He sees himself interacting in first person with others. Then there's a shift. He sees Belle, his former love, talking with her husband about Scrooge, and this is not one of his memories where he is present, and he can't handle it, so he squashes the cap down on the ghost and extinguishes him. Then he is taken by the second ghost, and from then on only witnesses events in the present with people he is connected to, but where he is not present, only talked of. And then finally we get to see how people respond to his death with the ghost of Christmas future, and at this stage he is another level removed from being present. The 3 spirits form a temporal trinity representing the stages Scrooge needs to go through in order to fully integrate his newfound truth so that he can turn it into wisdom. Essentially, what Scrooge needs to do is take the collective memories of what he knows from the past, then add the knowledge that comes from being present, and alert to what is wrong with his current situation, and then align these concepts with his higher moral understanding to create wisdom for future action. And in this way, the Trinity matches with the three aspects of the psyche: the id, the ego, and the superego. First, there's the ghost of Christmas past, who he's described as like a child, yet not so like a child as an old man. So here we have a ghost that is old but young at the same time. It's connected to the past and somehow present. It's the ego. I think for many it may seem intuitive that in this trinity, the present would be the ego, because the experience of the ego is like it exists in the present, and since it's the part of us that differentiates, that is where we feel like we operate from. But the ego also holds conscious memories and is connected with the past. Only the id, the emotions and instincts, are tied to the present. Another way that we know that we are dealing with the ego with the ghost of Christmas past is because all but the last of the scenes contains our main character interacting with the other characters, and this is the only ghost that shows him this. This is the function of the ego. By the time we get to the scenes that the second ghost shows him, he's not present, he's only talked of. And then when we get to the final ghost, who represents our moral self, Scrooge is dead. And since we know that Scrooge is having a problem with being cut off from his morality, this fits. The first ghost reminds Scrooge of what he already knows. He gets to remember what it is like to be young and vulnerable, which makes him think better of how he treated the poor Christmas caroler, and he tells the ghost, "There was a boy singing a Christmas carol at my door last night. I should have liked to have given him something." He is connected with the wounded child within and then sees the real boy without. He gets to remember that Christmas is awful when you are alone, and that it is so wonderful when you are together with loved ones, and that it makes a difference when the people who have the power and means to do so give and share to those who don't. And then he gets to remember what he gave up, and by his negative reaction to having that brought up, we can tell that he regrets displacing Belle with a golden idol. So the second ghost is clearly embodied as the id. Again, there's that association with food that often shows up with the emotional aspects, and also there's his transient quality of being tied to the day. He's the funnest spirit and the most vital and alive, and there's a real physicality to him. The second ghost points Scrooge beyond his limited sphere of containment, beyond his ego, and shows him all those he affects. Since Tiny Tim is introduced to us by this ghost, we can see that he likely represents the current state of Scrooge's emotional self. He's both an outward manifestation of what poverty can reduce people to, and an inward psychological metaphor for Scrooge's inner child. This shows that he's hurting deep down, and also outwardly, Scrooge's miserliness doesn't just affect himself, it is literally killing a boy by extension. The second ghost shows Scrooge that he has family, despite his own best efforts to throw them off, who are available to him to connect with, even though he has been rude to them. And then he shows him terrifying representations of what gets created by man's neglect. And of course, Scrooge sees that he has contributed to the creation of these two wretched creatures. All right, so that brings us to the third and final ghost. When Scrooge meets the ghost of Christmas yet to come, the spirit doesn't speak. Scrooge has to do all the talking and inferring. And this is what the superego does. It's like a moral authority within each of us, as if it's coming from outside of us, but really it's coming from within. It's the internalized messages that have been collecting in the psyche since childhood. So some people experience the superego as a parent or authority figure's voice in their head, when they are actually creating that voice themselves. They're not hearing voices, their superego is communicating through internal dialogue, and some of this is conscious and some is not. Since we are dealing with him being cut off from what he knows to be true deep down, he has to do his most work here, and that is why the ghost is so scary and dark, and the reality is so bleak. So to tie it all together, first we start in the realm of the ego where the issue has come to his attention, and then we go through the realm of emotions, which alerts him to what the problem is and how this realm is cut off and not happy with him, and it reinforces the idea that he is repressing his positive emotions. And then finally, we end up in the realm of the superego, where he gets to see the reality of what he is heading towards, or even where he is now, in a sense, if he does not fix the problem. And this indicates the state of his moral spirit. This story deals a lot with the issue of regret. This is all about coming to terms with the consequences of our own bad choices, and how you have to be willing to suspend your pride and that aspect of yourself that tries to protect your ego from the harsh truth so you can see what's really going on and make things right. And I think it's important to note that Scrooge gets to have his happy ending because he is brave enough to accept the truth about himself and then endeavor to change. He becomes like a second father to Tiny Tim, who does not die, but lives, and the story ends joyful and triumphant. But I think the biggest message here is in the name of the book. The moral isn't just that you need to spread the wealth if you're rich, because, well, so many of us are not rich, and many of us could use a little help. But the story is for everyone, because we're all supposed to think of this story as a Christmas carol. Because a Christmas carol spreads the message of Christmas. That idea of connection and sharing and the deeper meaning that is fundamental to the Christian part of the tradition. And even if you don't have money to share, you can share of yourself. It would have been so easy for Scrooge to show kindness to that poor little Christmas caroler. A coin from his vast pile of gold would have made a huge difference, but even a few moments to show appreciation for the child's gift of song or to join with the boy in harmony. And that's why I think his first moment of regret is about the way he treated the young caroler. That was when he connected with his inner boy child and began remembering what is right. Interestingly, the opposite of this story, I think, would be It's a Wonderful Life, where the main character gets to learn that he has everything he wants or needs in the relationships he's built through sacrifice, even though he was never able to build wealth. All right, well, I think that's more than enough for today. It's such a great story, and there's so much more to it, but I think I've probably hit my limit for the day. I'd be interested, though, to hear your thoughts. And do you have a favorite adaptation? I wish you all the best. Thanks for watching.